Great. So let's close that. And let's come back over here and take a look at what exactly happened when we told it to add the missing constraints. So there's several ways that we can view these constraints. Over here on the left, we've got these constraints right here. Now let's open that up. Okay, so we've got 4 things in here. I'm just going to drag this over, see if we can see the whole labels. All right. Okay, so we've got these 4 items here. It looks like each one of them is a different kind of constraint. They've each got different pictures and they have different names, and they say view here a lot and a top layout guide, and we'll cover that later. But let's see what happens when we click on one. Okay, so when we click on it, it will highlight the appropriate constraint on the view. And that just makes it easier to see which one is which. Let me get a little bit centered here. All right, so and now we can see that they're on the screen, so we can also just click on it directly. And if you click on it here, it will highlight the appropriate one over here, and vice versa. Now another thing we can do is if we click on the view, either over here or in here, you'll know you've clicked on it when you can see the white squares on the edges. And you'll also see over here that the information brings up the correct color related to our view. But we don't want to be in the attributes inspector. We want to be right here on the size inspector. All right, so we're in the size inspector now. All right, so there's a nice section right here called constraints, and that's what we want. So we can see there's a little image in here, sort of a graphical representation of the kinds of constraints that we added. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, similar to what we have on the screen here. And we can also see those same 4 constraints down here. And when you mouse over them, they'll highlight on the screen. Now this window right here, what this is doing is giving a visual indicator of the constraints that we have and what information they are providing. So when we click on this one right here, what it does is it hides all the constraints that don't have anything to do with this value, and it shows us the ones that affect this one in some way. So this kind of shows us that we're looking at the leading edge, or in our case, the left edge of the view. And we can see here we've got leading space to superview equals 81. Okay, so that looks like it means that the space between this edge of the object and the super view is 81. Okay, so what if we click right here? Okay, so this one, it's sort of centered, and oh, great, so it shows us that we're using a center alignment to the super view. But notice that we're missing a right edge and a bottom edge. Now, why is that? So the reason for this is that they're not necessary. Because we have the center alignment, both horizontally and vertically, auto layout is able to figure out where the left edge and the bottom edge should be. Because we know the location of the top edge, and because we know that we want it vertically centered, well, in order to be centered, it must be just as tall above the line as it is below the line. So auto layout is able to say, all right, well, what's the height between the center of the view and the top edge? So if that were 50, say, then we would know that the bottom edge just needs to be, again, 50 away in the other direction. So that's why we're able to just have these 4 constraints without having to tell it the bottom and the right edge at the same time. And the same logic applies for the horizontal direction between the left and the right side. All right, so now we know where to find our constraints and look at them and see which aspects of the view they're affecting, but what if we want to change them? So we can see right here, well, first let's unclick this so we see all 4 again. So we can see these edit buttons right here. So if we click on that, we get this little pop-up, and that allows us to change the values. All right, so 81. So what happens if we change that to 50? So we've changed it, and you want to make sure that you hit Tab or Enter. Oh, okay, great. So we got wider, because what we did was we reduced the size of the spacing from 81 to 50. So the edge used to be about here when it was 81 from the edge. But now that we said this bar only has to be 50, the side expanded. Now, let me undo that by hitting Control Z. So both sides shrunk back in. And again, this goes back to what I was saying about how it is able to infer where the right side should be based on the information about the left side and the fact that it's centered. So that's great. Constant. Okay, so what are our other options here? Okay, so we can see there's a less than or equal to, an equal to, and a greater than or equal to. We'll play with those later, but for now we just want to use the equal sign. We'll also notice over here that there's a drop down. We can use a standard value, which is grayed out, so that's not an option right now. And there's also the canvas value. And we click on that. Well, nothing happened. Now, the reason for that is because what's on our screen is already 81 away from the edge. But if we had not already added our missing constraints, this would be a place where if we hit this, it would update to wherever it was on the screen. So if you wanted to move it over into the corner, and that's where you actually wanted it, you could use this to update the value in here to match what you have on the screen. All right, what about this priority? Well, it sounds like it has to do with how important something is, and that's true. If we click on the arrow here, we see some default options: required, high, and low. So these have to do with how important a constraint is. The way that auto layout works is it looks at all the constraints at the same time and tries to satisfy them all at the same time. But sometimes you might have constraints that are in conflict. Auto layout looks at all of the constraints at the same time and tries to find what the correct positioning will be that will satisfy all of those constraints. So priority will come into play a little bit later when we need to get a little bit more advanced, but for now let's just leave it at 1000, which is required. Multiplier. Interesting. Looks like we've got some sort of ratios going on down here, but we're not going to play with that now. We're going to cover that later as well, in addition to the priority. All right, so we've gotten this little pop-up, checked it out. What happens if we double click? Oh, okay, so if we double click, we see more details. And we'll also notice that it highlighted it over here. So that's another way that you can get to this, is you can just click directly on these and we'll get that information updated in the right-hand panel. So let's come back over here. So it looks like these three are the same. We've got our 81, 1001. But up here, we've got first item, relation, and second item. So this is where we're defining who the relationship is between, which objects does it relate to. So the first item, you can see when we mouse over it, it highlights the object in the main view. And you can also see, again, anytime you sort of mouse over and hold, you'll get a little pop-up with a little bit more information about what something does in Xcode. So if we click on this, all right, so we've got leading, center X, trailing, relative to margin, respect language direction, reverse first and second item. So this one would be if you had accidentally created the connection in the wrong direction. So let's just see. So one thing that's interesting to note is that we've got this little dot here. So it's view.leading. So what this means is not only is the first item the view, but it's actually the leading edge of the view. Because otherwise, like if we say that the object is 5 from the left, well, 5 from the left where? It's very different if it's from the center of the object or the edge of the object. So this is where we're saying very explicitly which side of the object are we referring to. So what happens if we change this to center X? Ooh, wow, that changed something for sure. Well, we don't want to do that. So let's undo that with Control Z. Now, that's not because this isn't an option that we can play with. It just means that something about the way our view is set up, it doesn't like it when we do that. And here we can see this relation here. This is similar to what we saw in that quick edit menu as well, with the less than or equal, equal, greater than or equal. But again, we just want to leave it on equal. Now for the second item, again, so it's super view and the leading margin. So that for us means the margin on the left. Now you may be wondering about now, why do we say leading margin or trailing margin instead of just left and right? Well, the reason for this is, again, to account for different devices. But this time, instead of accounting for different device sizes, what this allows us to do is create our relationships so that they work regardless of whether a user's phone uses a language that is read right to left or left to right. And here you can see that the default checked is to respect language direction. So that means that in a left to right language such as English, if you want the beginning of a label to be on the leading edge of the page, so for us that would be the left side of the page, like over here, maybe if you wanted to have a profile picture and a user's name, but then if a user's device is in a language that's read from right to left, such as Arabic or Farsi or something along those lines, then what it would actually do is take this profile picture and the name label and put it over here instead. So it sort of will just mirror image those kinds of things. So it's important to note, if you don't want that kind of interaction, you'll need to uncheck this. So let's try choosing one of these. So let's say the center X within the margins. So then that will mean that the leading edge of our view should be positioned relative to the center X within the margins. So let's select that one. And again, our view is disappearing. Now that's really interesting. So let's try and take a look now at what might be happening. So let's go over here and click on our view and see where it went. Interesting. Okay, so now we can see that it's highlighted this line, and we can see those squares before that we had, but now there's just one here, and one here. So now what do you think is happening here? Looking at the constraints that we have, we told it that the X should be centered in the view. But then we also just told it that we wanted the leading edge of our view to be 81 away from the center of the view, and that would put it about here. Well, that doesn't work because the center of our view needs to be in the center. So the only way that auto layout is able to resolve this conflict is by deciding that our view has a width of 0. And if you've got view selected over here still, and we look over here in our size inspector, okay, we've got our X position and our Y position. We still have a height, but as I said, our width has been reduced to 0. So that's not what we want. So I'm just going to go ahead and Command Z right now to just undo that change. And if we click back over here, click off and then back on again, and you should see that the width goes back to 406, which is what we wanted. Let's just run it again to make sure that we've gotten back to what we had before. All right, great. So we've still got our rectangle with that nice clean border all around the edges. But you may be starting to think, well, running the simulator every few minutes takes a lot of time. So what are some other ways to get the visual feedback that we need to know that our constraints are doing what we think they're doing? So the first thing is, like I said before, when we were first placing our view, you could see those guidelines have you snapping into place. And they're still there now. There we go. But what happens when I move it over here? Interesting. So now I've got this orange dotted line and these sort of yellow-orange bars with these numbers like -60 and looks like -81. So what are those trying to say? So these are telling us that where the view is right now on the screen is not where it should be based on the constraints that we've given it. And you'll notice that this dotted outline, that's where our view used to be. So it's telling us that we have some conflicting information. What we're seeing is not what we'll actually get when we hit play. So let's run it again. And indeed, you can see that it's ignoring where we place things if there are constraints that say otherwise. So whenever you see these, that's an indicator that you have constraints that are telling it to be somewhere else. And maybe in this case, you're just moving it around and experimenting with other locations, but maybe sometimes you've accidentally moved it when you were trying to do something else. And there's a nice, quick, and easy way to get it back to where you wanted. You could use Control Z, but another option is when you have these dotted lines, come back over here. And this is where we added those missing constraints earlier. And now that's no longer an option. And that's because we have enough constraints. But now we're just not in the same location as where our constraints tell us we should be. So if we look up here, there's a couple other options. We can update frames or update constraints. So we're working with constraints, so let's update our constraints. Great. Okay, so the dotted line went away, and well, now it looks what happened is it literally did what it said. It updated our constraints. It changed our values over here. We still have the same kinds of constraints, but it just changed the values. So instead of 81, now we're at -28 because our view is sort of extending beyond the edges of the screen in a negative direction. So if we run it with Command R, all right, we see that it definitely got moved over to be sticking off the edge of the screen. But that isn't really what we wanted. We wanted the square to go back to where we had it before. So let's undo that. Let's hit Command Z. So now when we select it again, we can see our outline of where it's supposed to be. So let's go back over here to this menu, and now this time let's update frames. There we go. That's what we wanted. So updating frames moves the objects in Interface Builder back to where they should be based on the constraints that you've already told it has. So this is that nice way to get back to where you were. Well, this hasn't taken away our need to run things in the simulator. It just sort of helped us get back to where we were and gave us some visual clues that we accidentally moved something that we didn't want to. But there's another thing that we can do to get more of a live preview. And the way to do that is we're going to go up here in this top bar, and we want to click on the Assistant Editor. Now this is the one that looks like sort of a crooked Venn diagram. And we want to click on that to activate it. And you can see it opens up a second window. And it's defaults to showing us the code that is related to the view that we're looking at. And that's very useful in many cases when you're in Storyboard. But right now what we want to do is instead of automatic, right up here, let's click on that. And let's go down to Preview. And then it's the option right here for Main Storyboard Preview, and select that. Oh wow, awesome. So this is actually showing us what we see when we run the simulator. You can see down here it's telling us iPhone 4-inch. So this is the size screen that we're getting. We've got our status bar up here, and again, this nice spacing, and our rectangular view in the middle. So now we don't have to run the simulator to know that we're still going to get a rectangle when we run the view. And you may also notice there's this little symbol down here for rotating. This is, again, simulating for us what we would see if we ran the simulator or a device and we turned the phone. It shows us that the constraints still apply because it's maintaining that border around the edges and being centered. And if you want to be absolutely sure, you can run the simulator. And the way to rotate the simulator is if you click up here on Hardware, you can see Rotate Left and Rotate Right. And the hotkeys for that are Command left arrow and right arrow, respectively. So we're going to go ahead and rotate it. Now it looks a little bit different because in our simulator we're doing iPhone 6, but in here it's doing iPhone 4. Well, what if we definitely want to see what it's going to look like for an iPhone 6? To do that, we want to come back over here. Let's unrotate this. And down here in the bottom, there's this little plus sign. If we click on that, it gives us the option to choose what we have in our preview. But here we want to select the 4.7. This is the iPhone 6 size, with the iPhone 5.5-inch being the 6 Plus. But let's select this one and see if it actually matches closer with what we see in the simulator. There we go. So it's also a little bigger. And in this view, you can also zoom in and out. And it's nice that you can actually see things side by side. Now we may decide that iPhones are more or less similar enough that we get the general idea. So we just want to see the iPhone 6. So we can click on this one, see that blue outline, and hit the delete button and just take it away. Maybe instead what we want to do is we want to see what does it also look like at on the iPad at the same time. And you can see it's much bigger. But again, we can use the pinching motion on our trackpad to zoom out. Now you can see that this is less of a rectangle because again, it's preserving the spacing around the edging and sizing the view to make that happen. So this is going to be great. This is going to help us a lot see much faster what the changes are. So let's drag this over. We don't need to look at that in too much detail right now. And we can make this side smaller as well. And again, zoom out a little bit so you get a full view of what's happening. And then we'll just recenter this right here. Well, I told you it was a live preview, but I haven't proved it yet. So let's click on our view and let's choose something to change. Let's change this leading space again. Let's change it to 0 and then hit tab. Wow, there we go. So we saw those changes instantly in the preview. And this is going to be very helpful. For most situations, using this live preview is going to be more than enough so that you don't have to run the simulator as often. We will run into a few situations later on in the tutorial where I'll show you that running the simulator every now and then is important. But for now, it's really nice to know that we don't have to run it with every single change that we make.